Hi, I'm Max Kaiser, and welcome once again to On the Edge, coming to you from sunny downtown Tehran, Iran. Let's go to London to talk with Thomas C. Mountain. Thomas is an independent journalist living in Eritrea and writes often on the Horn of Africa. Thomas, welcome to the Edge.
Thanks, Max. Nice to be back.
All righty. Thomas C. Mountain, you are an expert on the Horn of Africa. So your thoughts on the recent WikiLeaks Cablegate revelations that the U.S. essentially hired Ethiopian President Meles Zenawi, I'm probably saying that incorrectly, to invade Somalia in 2006.
Well, I haven't had a chance to really review all 1,300 and some documents. It's pretty much common knowledge that Meles was sent in, and I don't think he was too happy about it, because in history, no Ethiopian regime has ever picked a fight with the Somalis. There was a war between Somalia and Ethiopia in 1977, but that was started by the Somalis. So I don't think any Ethiopian president in his right mind would volunteer to start a war with Somalia. So I think he pretty much was pressured by his masters that pay his salary and his military budget in the United States.
Right. Well, this is what we're seeing with these WikiLeaks revelations, is the U.S. just basically interfering all over the world, extra legally, no due process, no consideration for the law, no consideration for human rights or civil rights, and they're just making a mess wherever they go. But the cables also show Blackwater pitching in to get involved in Somalia. What's the empire's interest in Somalia? Do they have any oil?
Well, yeah, there's supposed to be a lot of oil and gas, but I think it's more of a, just in general, the Americans' foreign policy, particularly in regards to Africa, is what we call crisis management. They want to instigate a crisis and then manage the crisis so that basically they can prevent any strong nationalist government from coming to power that would protect the people's interests, which would force the Western governments to pay a fair share for their natural resources. Basically, they just want to be able to come in and pay off some warlords and rape and loot the resources of the country whenever possible. And I think that's pretty much U.S. policy in Somalia. They know that the Somali, if a genuine nationalist government comes into power in Somalia, they're going to be pretty hostile to Western interests, especially the United States, because the U.S. has committed a long list of very nasty crimes in Somalia. So they just want to see the warlords in power. And when the Union of Islamic Courts came to power, brought peace to Mogadishu for the first time in 2006, the Americans sent their Ethiopian gendarmes, or their policemen on the beat, in to destroy that peace. So I don't think the U.S. has any good intentions towards Somalia at all.
But tell me something about Somalia. I heard, you can help me pick through this, whether this is all nonsense or not, but I heard that in Somalia, Coca-Cola has these huge tankers parked outside that are filled with Coke syrup. It's the largest distribution point for Coke syrup, and effectively Coke syrup is the currency of Somalia. Is that crazy, or is that somewhere near accurate?
That's the first I've heard of that. I mean, the Somali pirates, of course, have collected about $500 million and more hijacking ships. And there's been a lot of talk about, oh, they're trying to defend their fishing rights and other things. But the bottom line is, you've got a lot of ships presently hijacked in Somalia, and the pirates there are basically working for the warlords. The pirates capture a ship, they have to pay off the local warlord, they have to pay off the district warlord, they have to pay off the presidential warlord, they have to pay off the Ethiopian military, and they have to, of course, pay off Meles Zenawi in Addis Ababa. And in exchange for that, they get protection. The Ethiopian regime is the U.S. policeman on the beat. They pretty much told the United States and all the Western countries to lay off the Somali pirates because they're paying protection money, and that explains why there hasn't been a single cruise missile come whistling to the doors of any of these pirate lairs after they've collected their loot. That's something that no one in the Western media wants to talk about, is how come there has been zero retaliation against these pirates. Okay. The Americans have bombed.
How much are you saying? 500 million, you say?
Over 500 million, yes.
Okay, and so you're positing that essentially the American pirates, the Wall Street banks, are somehow involved in taking a cut of that, and it's easy money for them, And of course, you would never go in there and disrupt easy money. There's a stock exchange that's sprung up around the piracy that's going on. Real estate prices are exploding. So it's like the Hamptons. You got the crooks and the pirates on Wall Street, and the real estate market in the Hamptons goes up. Here in Somalia, you've got pirates out there, 500 million or so, looting, and the real estate market around that area goes up, and you've got the same crooks, the same financial terrorists, the overlord financial terrorists, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Warren Buffett, etc., in there taking a cut. Now, what's the mechanism for them to take the cut? I mean, it's not the IMF. They're not the intermediary disruptive terrorist force. It's not the World Bank. What's the intermediary force that does holds the bag man for the Wall Street banks in Somalia?
Well, like the American foreign policy is based on using a local policeman on the beat. And Meles Zenawi is the one that most of the money ends up in his pocket. He has his warlords in Puntland, where most of the pirates come from, and Puntland is located right on the very tip of the Horn of Africa. So there's a payoff that starts with some desperados going out in small open boats and snatching these ships and collecting cash. And they land on the beach, and oftentimes they head right for the nearest Ethiopian military base to make their payoff, to make sure that no one comes in and bombs them in their homes. So in any case, Meles Zenawi is the bag man.
Okay, but who's the banking facility here? Is it the Swiss banks? I heard Tel Aviv now is a huge money laundering operation, kind of picking up the slack from Switzerland. I mean, where's the money laundering, the main money laundering going on for this particular global scam?
Well, Ethiopia is the center of an enormous aid to arms diversion scandal. I mean, something like $6 billion a year, according to the latest reports I've seen, is funneled to the Meles Zenawi regime to keep him in power there and enforce the interests of the IMF and the World Bank in that part of the world. So I think it's pretty much they pay off Meles Zenawi and he does what they want him to, like invade Somalia, invade Eritrea, where I lived 10 years ago. So I mean, I think it's right now Meles Zenawi is carrying out a genocide in the Ogaden, and it's escalating into a full-blown genocide where he's rounding up tens of thousands of ethnic Somalis in the Ethiopian Ogaden and putting them into basically starvation camps. The expression is, if you can't catch the fish, meaning the Ogaden rebels, you drain the lake, and that's what he's doing. He's accelerating the Ogaden genocide, and the purpose of all that is just basically to keep Meles Zenawi in power so he can protect imperial American interests, or Pax Americana, in the Horn of Africa, which is one of the most strategic areas in the world. All the trade between Asia and Europe passes through the Horn of Africa every day. So the Americans have got Meles Zenawi there, protecting the bank's interests, protecting the interests of the financial terrorists, and he's the guy that's got the huge bank accounts in London, and hundreds of millions of dollars, and this has been going on for decades now.
Okay, so that kind of gets toward what I was asking about. So Meles Zenawi is going through London, not Switzerland or Tel Aviv, to launder the money. $6 billion a year in arms deals. Of course, arms dealing being America's huge money laundering operation globally. $1 trillion of tax money collected from those poor schmucks in America every year that goes to the IRS ends up in the Pentagon, and then that ends out buying guns for terrorists around the world, like this fellow Meles Zenawi, who's using billions of dollars in arms deals to launder the money he's stealing vis-a-vis the Somali pirates. I tell you, he should just go public on the New York Stock Exchange. He'd get a better valuation. He could be like the Groupon or the Google of piracy. He could be worth $200 billion instead of just maybe $20 billion. But anyway, let's move on. Blackwater, now known as Z. Let's talk about their involvement a little bit more. Are they visible? Do they wear big branded, uniforms like where is Blackwater Z, the mercenaries for hire, or are they more, underground?
Well, I don't think even Blackwater wants to go into Somalia. What they've been doing is they've been using Ugandan proxies and Burundian proxies in Mogadishu to try to prop up this puppet regime that they claim is the government of Somalia. And what they've been doing with these Ugandan and Burundian troops who've got the blessing of the United Nations under the African Union is every time the guerrilla fighters attack them successfully, in frustration, they fire artillery rounds into the surrounding civilian neighborhoods. And most people don't realize when you hear reports of deaths in Mogadishu, almost all of that's caused by mortar and artillery rounds fired by United Nations-blessed African Union troops. So there's been probably tens of thousands of Somalis killed by the United Nations and the African Union troops in Somalia, who they have the gall to call peacekeepers.
All right, now, Thomas Mountain, you live in Africa, where missionaries and charities have operated for centuries as the unarmed wing of the empire. Tell us about the human rights mob. Who are they? Why do they call themselves a mob?
Well, I've labeled them the human rights mob because George Soros is the financial hitman. George the Hitman Soros has just given $1 billion over the next 10 years in a matching grant to Human Rights Watch. Now, this is a matching grant, meaning that through other foundations and trusts, which George Soros has laundered donations to the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International for years now, he'll give them another $1 billion. So Human Rights Watch is about to collect $2 billion in the next 10 years from George the Hitman Soros. Now, what's Human Rights Watch going to do with this? Well, George Soros got on National Public Radio in the United States and said, we're going to expand Human Rights Watch into the developing world. We're going to have offices of Human Rights Watch basically gathering intelligence and influencing public and government policy in the developing world as much as possible towards policies that favor George Soros. Now, why do we call George Soros the hitman? Well, a good example is the Rose Revolution in Georgia, when George Soros put over $42 million through his NGO fronts into supporting the Saakashvili regime. Now, $42 million, that's almost $10 per person in Georgia. Now, that would be like in the United States if George Soros spent $3 billion on the American election, putting Barack Obama into power. And what did he do? As soon as Saakashvili came to power, he started arresting the opposition. He started torturing opposition members. Opposition members started disappearing. And on top of that, Saakashvili had his military attack the South Ossetians, who he claims are his own people, opening artillery fire on civilian communities. And what kind of massacre would have happened if the Russians hadn't counterattacked and driven him out? And all this was paid for by George Soros, putting Saakashvili in power. Now, this is blood money now. These NGOs that put Saakashvili in power with this $42 million have got blood stains on their hands. And the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International kept their mouths shut when all this happened. They're quick to jump out and condemn Eritrea for alleged human rights abuses, which are pretty much non-existent, and yet they're very quiet when it comes to a program that George Soros is funding. So I call them, the human rights mob. They're taking the hitman's money, and they're attacking countries like Eritrea that are really doing a lot of things to promote human rights, like provide clean drinking water to the people, make sure everybody is fed, that people have a roof over their head, and people have decent medical care. These are really the basic human rights, not freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of elections, which is what Human Rights and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty proclaim so loudly about. So the fact is that basically the human rights movement has been bought off by a financial terrorist like George Soros to the tune of $2 billion. $2 billion for Human Rights Watch? It's an incredible amount of money in 10 years. What are they going to do with it? We know what they're going to do with it. They're going to go in and be a front for Soros in the third world and the developing world.
But Thomas Mountain, didn't you read The Alchemy of Finance? George Soros's masterpiece where he explains reflexivity, which basically says if you manipulate the price of a market enough, it will become the new normal, and then you can cash in on your manipulation and say, oh, it was the market and not me?
I'll have to read that, Max. Thanks for the tip.
Yeah, it's a how-to guide on how to manipulate markets. And just to be clear, the human rights mob is a label you've given these groups, and you're saying basically they're taking the money from Soros, who has a vested interest in manipulating these markets, and claiming to be somehow a man interested in furthering human rights, but in fact he's only interested in furthering his net worth. And he's not really doing well on either side. As a hedge fund manager or as a human rights philanthropist, I think he's kind of give him a B. But anyway, let's move on to another one of these global, globe-trotting do-gooders that seems to do bad more than good. Bill Gates, multi-billionaire founder of Microsoft. You write, quote, Bill Gates' $10 billion vaccine scam, end quote. I take it you don't find his charitable work in Africa very charitable, Thomas Mountain.
Yes, well, I'll give you an example. I live in Eritrea, which has reduced malaria mortality in the last 8 years by almost 85%. Now, malaria is the #1 killer in Africa, and this has been the biggest breakthrough in history in fighting malaria mortality. And it's not a medicine-based program, it's a public health-based program, providing insect-treated mosquito nets and making sure they get retreated, making sure that there are clinics within a couple hours walk of all the villages in the malaria belt. And through this basic public health, Eritrea has made the biggest breakthrough in malaria treatment in history. Now, George Soros has turned around, Bill Gates has turned around and donated, well, it's actually a tax write-off. My sources say over $1 billion to develop a quote-unquote vaccine for malaria. People that know malaria know that it's a very resistant, very quickly develops resistance to drugs, and that in 5 years after the latest vaccine comes out, it won't work anymore, but by then its patent will have expired, and Africa will have to buy a new vaccine. And every 5 years, a new vaccine, and tens of billions of dollars in African blood money will get sucked out of Africa to pay for these latest vaccines. And the fact is that Bill Gates has got tens of billions of dollars invested in the major pharmaceutical companies. So this donation was actually a tax write-off, is going to end up bringing back tens of billions of dollars if Bill Gates has his way back into the pockets of the major international pharmaceutical companies, and it'll pay off in 10 times or more what Bill Gates has donated to this fight. Now, the World Health Organization, which recently has been exposed as being a front for the major pharmaceuticals when it raised this big hysteria about the swine flu, and for example, France had to destroy 350 million euros of vaccine, which the World Health Organization said they had to buy. And what they've done basically is come in and suppress news about this big breakthrough in malaria mortality in Eritrea because it's public health based. It's not pharmaceutical based. So, tens of millions of lives could be saved if the rest of Africa and the rest of the world will emulate and copy and use Eritrea's role model to prevent malaria deaths. Instead, they're suppressing knowledge of this.
Yeah, well, Bill Gates is a twice convicted predatory monopolist in the area of intellectual property. So it makes sense that his solution to a problem would be to increase and expand more intellectual property that comes under the rubric of those laws that is a known economic fallacy and drainer of economies, not value added to economies. Let's move on to the land grab that's going on in many nations, including Saudi Arabia and China, and many hedge funds, including George Soros, are buying land in Africa. I take it this is just more of the same, Thomas Mountain.
Well, there is some international companies and governments coming into Ethiopia and buying up some of the prime agricultural land. Of course, millions and tens of millions of people in Ethiopia are literally starving or on the verge of starvation, and yet some of the prime agricultural land is being sold or leased for 99 years to countries like Saudi Arabia, which exports something like 10,000 tons of rice from Ethiopia last year, while millions of Ethiopians are literally starving to death. So I mean, of course, several $1 million every one of these deals gets put into Meles Zenawi's London bank accounts. But, that's a pretty good example of how, when you get a gangster like Meles Zenawi in power, he doesn't care what happens to his own people.
Right. Is this, let's talk about China for a second. Is it a positive or a negative, their influence going on there?
Well, I think China's actually overall been quite positive. I'll give you an example. In Sudan, Sudan is the largest and potentially richest country in Africa. And the West really wants to see, United States in particular, wants to see Sudan divided because northern Sudan is under the leadership of Bashir, who they claim is a genocidal killer, when, the facts on the ground is that the Darfur relief effort is one of the largest, best-run relief efforts in history, and that without the support and leadership of Bashir, it would not have been successful. So actually, there never was a genocide in Sudan. Of course,
wait a minute. There was never a genocide in Sudan. Explain that a little bit more. I mean, this could be news to George Clooney and some celebrities in Los Angeles. What do you mean there's never been a genocide in Sudan? Explore that a little bit.
Well, I was one of the first Westerners to write about the problems in Sudan in 2003. The problems in Darfur were mainly a civil war that took place mainly in 2004 and some part of 2005. And maybe 30,000 people died. Now, that's a big tragedy. But The relief effort started then, and international forces, along with the Sudan security forces, came in and pretty much stopped all the violence by 2006. Okay, so maybe 30,000 people died in Sudan. That was way back in 2004, 2005. And since then, the people of Darfur who victims of this violence have been the recipients of one of the largest, best-run relief efforts in history. And the UN people and the aid people on the ground in Sudan will tell you that this very successful relief effort would not have been possible without the cooperation and support of President Bashir and his government. Okay, so there hasn't been a genocide in Sudan. Instead, the genocide, which you, Max, were what the first international news program to cover, is the genocide in the Ogaden, which, by the way, Max, puts you on the edge, because the real genocide is being funded by the West in the Ogaden in Ethiopia. It never happened in Sudan. That was all a big scam to brainwash everybody to say, hey, we need to send troops in there to protect the genocide victims so the West can come in and take over the largest and potentially wealthiest country in Africa.
All right, we've got about a minute left. Following up on this note that we broke the story on the edge, is there one thing that the mainstream media is not covering right now that we can break for our global audience here today?
Well, like I just was talking about, this breakthrough in malaria and malaria mortality prevention in Eritrea. That's a big story. But the Ogaden genocide is starting to accelerate. When you broke the story earlier this year, it was a low-level genocide. Now it's accelerating with the development where they're starting to put together these starvation camps, or they're rounding up the Ogaden people into these camps. They've kicked all the Western aid agencies out of the Ogaden. Meles Zenawi has, including Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross. And now they're rounding the people up, and they're basically going to starve them to death in these camps. And we're talking about 10, 12, maybe 15 million potential victims. And this is all being paid for by the Western tax dollars. So, I mean, I think this Ogaden genocide is probably the biggest news story that's starting to accelerate and that the West is not talking about. And it was first broken here on your program, Max.
All right, Thomas C. Mountain, thanks so much for being once again on the edge.
And thank you, Max.
And that's all the time we have today for On the Edge. I want to thank my guest, Thomas C. Mountain. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.